I didn't kill my wife to save money. I have millions. My father has lunch with the Supreme Court. People like me don't go to prison.
Your bank account doesn't buy freedom here. You are sentenced to life without parole. Take him away.
Get off me! Dad called the governor. I'm not wearing a jumpsuit. I'm a Wilson!
The perfect facade of affluence in Austin's West Lake Hills neighborhood shattered on the evening of March 15th, 2023, when first responders discovered the body of 32-year-old Elena D'Angelo Ashford sprawled unnaturally at the bottom of her sweeping marble staircase, her 7-month pregnant belly still visibly rounded against the growing pool of blood. Her husband, Thaddeus "Thad" Montgomery Wilson, a 35-year-old investment banker with family connections that stretched into the Texas judiciary, stood in the foyer with an expression that Detective James Jackson would later describe as performative shock. His eyes wide but dry, his manicured hands visibly steady as he provided a statement about returning from his weekly golf game to find his wife had tragically fallen. What initially appeared to be a devastating accident would soon unravel into one of the most chilling cases of premeditated domestic homicide in Austin's recent history, exposing the calculated depravity that can lurk behind the veneer of privilege and success. The perfect family image that Thad had meticulously cultivated, the Tudor-style mansion in an exclusive gated community, the Harvard MBA proudly displayed in his home office, the country club membership, and the expectant wife with the right pedigree, was about to be scrutinized under the unforgiving lights of a criminal investigation that would lead to the harshest sentence allowed under Texas law. When Detective Jackson arrived at the scene at 7:42 p.m., the ambulance had already departed without Elena, her death apparent to the paramedics, who could detect no signs of life in her battered body. The luxury home's immaculate interior stood in stark contrast to the chaotic scene at the staircase. Designer furniture and curated art collections surrounding what was clearly a violent end to a young woman's life. Thad's story seemed straightforward enough. He'd been at Barton Creek Country Club with business associates for their standing Thursday afternoon golf game. Returned home around 7:15 p.m. to find Elena unresponsive at the bottom of the stairs, and immediately dialed 911 while attempting CPR, as instructed by the emergency dispatcher. Initial observations, however, triggered the detective's trained skepticism. The position of Elena's body seemed inconsistent with a simple fall, and faint bruising marks on her upper arms appeared to resemble finger impressions rather than impact trauma. If you're enjoying this, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue to bring these important cases to light and ensure that victims' stories are never forgotten. My wife has been under tremendous stress with the pregnancy, Thad explained to Jackson in a steady voice that never cracked, his cashmere sweater still pristine despite his claims of attempting life-saving measures. Her doctor mentioned how hormones can cause dizziness and balance issues. I've been worried about her navigating these stairs for weeks. The detective noted how Thad's explanation seemed rehearsed, almost clinical in its delivery, while simultaneously providing a ready-made excuse for any evidence that might contradict an accidental fall. Crime scene investigators were already methodically documenting the scene, taking particular interest in a small smear of blood on the wall several feet from the staircase and what appeared to be broken fingernails on Elena's right hand. As the initial investigation proceeded, Detective Jackson requested to see Thad's cell phone, a standard procedure that suddenly caused the first crack in the husband's composed demeanor. "I'd prefer to consult with my attorney first," Thad replied, his jaw tightening visibly as he mentioned that his father, Montgomery Wilson, was a former state appeals court judge who would want to ensure everything is handled properly. This moment of resistance raised the first official red flag in what would later be described as a textbook case of a controlling spouse eliminating what he viewed as his property rather than allowing it to leave him, a catastrophic failure of narcissistic entitlement that would eventually lead to Thad Wilson being sentenced to life without parole, plus an additional 50 years for the death of his unborn son under Georgia's Unborn Victims of Violence Act. The scene inside the Wilson home grew more crowded as additional forensic personnel arrived, including the medical examiner who performed a preliminary examination of Elena's body before transport. "I'm noting multiple contusions inconsistent with a single fall," the ME stated quietly to Jackson, pointing to defensive bruising on Elena's forearms and a distinct pattern of bruises around her neck that suggested manual strangulation. The detective watched as Thad paced in the kitchen, making calls from a landline rather than his cell phone, his voice dropping to whispers whenever investigators moved within earshot. When Thad excused himself to use the restroom, a junior officer reported seeing him washing his hands thoroughly and examining his own forearm, where 3 distinct scratch marks were visible beneath his pushed-up sleeve. As night fell over the exclusive Austin neighborhood, news vans began gathering at the community gate, drawn by police scanner chatter about a potential homicide involving prominent local figures. The D'Angelo family, Elena's parents Vincent and Gabriella, and her sister Sophia, arrived together in a state of shock, having received the devastating call from Detective Jackson rather than from Thad. Something wasn't right between them lately, Sophia told Jackson through tears, explaining that Elena had seemed increasingly isolated over the past several months. She stopped coming to family dinners without calling first to check if it was convenient for Thad's schedule. This pattern of isolation from support networks would later be recognized as a classic tactic employed by Thad to maintain control over his wife, a control that had been threatened when Elena discovered his long-running affair. The initial processing of the scene took hours, with investigators documenting the position of furniture, blood spatter patterns, and collecting potential evidence, including Elena's cell phone, which was found in an unusual location, inside a kitchen drawer, rather than near her body, where one would expect if she had been carrying it before falling. When Detective Jackson inquired about this, Thad provided another ready explanation. Elena was constantly misplacing her phone. Pregnancy brain, you know. What he couldn't explain, however, was why the phone appeared to have been recently reset to factory settings, an action that would later be proven to have occurred after the estimated time of death. By midnight, the Austin Police Department had established a command center in the neighborhood clubhouse, with Detective Jackson coordinating the initial investigation and requesting priority processing of evidence collected from the scene. Initial photographs revealed a troubling inconsistency with Thad's account. Elena's injuries showed evidence of multiple impacts rather than a single fall, and the blood spatter analysis suggested at least some of the violence had occurred away from the staircase. The county's assistant district attorney, Harper Harris, was notified of the suspicious death and authorized expedited warrants for electronic devices and financial records that would later prove crucial in unraveling Thad's elaborate deception. As Thad's attorney, his father's former law partner, arrived at the scene, the suspect's demeanor shifted subtly from concerned husband to strategically cautious client. "My client has cooperated fully, but will be making no further statements tonight," the attorney announced, placing a protective hand on Thad's shoulder while scanning the room with the practiced eye of a seasoned defense lawyer. Detective Jackson nodded professionally while mentally noting the speed with which Thad had transitioned from grieving spouse to defensive subject, a behavioral tell that experienced homicide investigators recognize as potentially significant. Elena's body was carefully removed from the home shortly after 1 a.m., transported to the medical examiner's office for a complete autopsy that would ultimately reveal the true extent of the violence she had suffered. As the stretcher passed through the foyer, Sophia D'Angelo Chen collapsed against her husband, her anguished cry punctuating the methodical sounds of the investigation. Thad, standing with his attorney in the kitchen doorway, watched the scene without visible emotion, a moment captured by a crime scene photographer that would later feature prominently in the prosecution's case file as evidence of his profound detachment from the human tragedy unfolding before him. The night wore on as investigators continued processing the scene, paying special attention to Thad's home office, where his laptop remained open on an expensive mahogany desk. While a warrant would be required to search its contents, a quick glance at the screen revealed an open browser window quickly closed by Thad when he noticed the investigator's interest, a fleeting glimpse of what appeared to be a life insurance website that would later prove to be a critical piece of the prosecution's case. My client is understandably reviewing his family's financial situation, given this tragedy, his attorney explained smoothly, positioning himself between the computer and the investigator in a move that suggested conscious protection of potentially incriminating evidence. The morning after Elena's death dawned with a somber grayness over Austin as Detective Jackson stood watching the medical examiner's preliminary assessment of Elena's body at the county morgue. These injuries are inconsistent with a simple fall, Dr. Vivian Chen stated firmly, pointing to distinct bruising patterns on Elena's neck and torso that suggested direct physical assault rather than the impact trauma expected from tumbling downstairs. The positioning of defensive wounds on her forearms and the broken fingernails with tissue samples underneath indicated that Elena had fought desperately against her attacker in the final moments of her life. Most devastating of all was the condition of the 28-week-old male fetus, who had suffered fatal trauma during the attack but showed no genetic abnormalities or developmental issues that might have complicated the pregnancy. This was a healthy baby boy who would never take his first breath. Detective Jackson's next stop was the crime lab, where technicians were already processing evidence collected from the Wilson home, including trace evidence from under Elena's fingernails that would later be confirmed as containing Thad's DNA. Fibers found embedded in the bruises on Elena's neck matched the distinctive weave of the cashmere sweater Thad had been wearing when police arrived, a connection that directly contradicted his claim of finding her body upon returning home. A technician handed Jackson a preliminary report on blood evidence found in the master bathroom sink trap, explaining that someone had attempted to thoroughly clean the drain, but hadn't managed to eliminate all microscopic traces of what appeared to be blood matching Elena's type. Across town, in an affluent neighborhood near Barton Creek Country Club, Thad Wilson sat in his attorney's home office, maintaining his innocence while constructing what he believed to be an airtight alibi. "I was playing golf with Ron Michaels and Peter Drummond from 3 p.m. until at least 6:30. You can verify with the club's security cameras and credit card receipts from the clubhouse bar afterward." Thad recited his whereabouts with confident precision, seemingly unaware that digital forensic specialists were already examining the built-in GPS and logging systems of his Tesla Model X, systems that would later reveal his vehicle had left the country club parking lot at 4:15 p.m., returned to his home address for approximately 47 minutes, then traveled back to the club before finally returning home at the time he reported finding Elena's body. The preliminary timeline constructed by investigators suggested that Elena had died between 4:30 p.m. and 5:30 p.m., precisely during the window when Thad's Tesla had been tracked returning to their home. Security camera footage from the gated community's entrance confirmed the Tesla's movements, showing Thad's vehicle entering at 4:27 p.m. and exiting at 5:14 p.m., a critical 47-minute period that directly contradicted his alibi. Investigators also noted that Thad had taken an unusual route home that avoided the main community entrance where he would normally enter, instead using a secondary gate that had fewer security cameras and was primarily used by maintenance vehicles. By afternoon, Detective Jackson and his partner, Detective Maria Sanchez, were conducting interviews with the country club staff who had interacted with Thad on the day of Elena's death. Mr. Wilson seemed distracted during the first few holes, reported the caddy who had accompanied Thad's foursome. He received a phone call around the fourth hole that seemed to upset him, and after that, he told his playing partners he needed to make an important business call and would catch up with them later. This testimony directly contradicted Thad's claim of continuous presence at the golf course and established a pattern of deception that would become central to the prosecution's case. The victim's sister, Sophia D'Angelo Chen, provided investigators with critical context about Elena's marriage during her emotional interview at the police station. Elena discovered Thad was having an affair about 2 months ago and had consulted a divorce attorney. She was planning to leave him after the baby was born. Sophia described her sister's increasing fears about Thad's controlling behavior, including his habit of tracking Elena's location through her phone, monitoring her emails, and isolating her from friends and family members he deemed negative influences on their marriage. She told me last week that she'd decided to move in with me after the birth and would only allow Thad supervised visitation with their son. She was terrified of what he might do when he realized he couldn't control her anymore. As detectives built their case, digital forensics experts began the painstaking process of recovering deleted data from Thad's laptop, which had been seized under warrant the morning after Elena's death. Using specialized software to access the unallocated disk space, technicians discovered recently deleted browser searches that painted a damning picture of premeditation, fetal homicide sentencing Georgia, pregnant woman fall downstairs accident investigation, and life insurance. Payout timeline pregnant spouse. These searches, conducted over the 3 weeks preceding Elena's death, directly contradicted Thad's claim that the death was an unforeseen accident and suggested he had been researching both the method of murder and its potential legal and financial consequences. The autopsy results, delivered to Detective Jackson late that evening, confirmed what the preliminary examination had suggested. Elena had died from manual strangulation, followed by blunt force trauma consistent with being pushed down the stairs, after she was already unconscious or deceased. Most tellingly, the medical examiner noted petechial hemorrhaging in Elena's eyes and defensive bruising that indicated she had been conscious and fighting back during the initial strangulation. This was no accident, Dr. Chen concluded in her official report, documenting the extensive bruising around Elena's neck that matched the size and spacing of adult male hands. At the D'Angelo family home, Elena's parents sat with investigators, sharing details about their daughter's increasingly troubled marriage, while Sophia methodically gathered childhood photos for the memorial service. Elena called me 3 days before she died, Gabriella D'Angelo revealed through tears. She said Thad had installed some kind of monitoring app on her phone and had confronted her about calling her divorce attorney. Vincent D'Angelo, a retired civil engineer, added that he'd offered to help Elena move out immediately, but she had insisted on waiting until after the baby was born, believing that Thad would never physically harm her despite his emotional manipulation and controlling behavior. Detective Jackson's investigation took a significant turn when digital forensics revealed that Thad had purchased a $2 million life insurance policy on Elena just 6 weeks before her death, a policy that specifically included coverage for the unborn child and contained no exclusionary period for payout. The insurance agent who had processed the application reported that Thad had been unusually insistent about expediting the policy and had paid the annual premium in full, despite the company's standard monthly payment option. He specifically asked about the claim process multiple times, the agent noted in his statement to police, particularly about how quickly a claim might be processed in the event of an accident. The strategic planning behind Elena's murder became increasingly apparent as investigators uncovered evidence of Thad's methodical preparation, including his recent purchase of a home security system that he had installed himself, a system that, suspiciously, had no stored footage from the day of Elena's death, despite being marketed as having continuous cloud backup. The system's logs showed that it had been manually disabled between 4:25 p.m. and 5:20 p.m. on March 15th, corresponding precisely with the window during which Thad's Tesla had returned to the house and during which Elena was killed. 3 days after Elena's death, Detective James Jackson and Detective Maria Sanchez prepared for their formal interview with Thad Wilson at Austin Police Headquarters, strategically employing elements of the Reed technique, a psychological approach designed to elicit confessions through minimization and maximization tactics. The interview room had been carefully arranged, a small table with uncomfortable chairs, a one-way mirror through which the district attorney's representative would observe, and a discreetly positioned camera to record every microexpression and verbal response. "Remember, we're just having a conversation to clarify a few inconsistencies," Jackson told Thad as he entered with his attorney, knowing that presenting the interview as a routine follow-up rather than an interrogation might lower Thad's defensive barriers. The initial phase of questioning focused on establishing rapport, with Jackson sympathetically acknowledging the difficulty of losing both a wife and unborn child in such tragic circumstances, while subtly observing Thad's body language, noting particularly how the suspect maintained unwavering eye contact in a manner that seemed rehearsed rather than natural. "Walk me through your day on March 15th, starting from the morning," Jackson requested casually, watching as Thad recited what sounded like a memorized timeline that matched his previous statements exactly, a common tell among suspects who have constructed false narratives. Thad described his morning routine, his meetings at his investment firm, and his afternoon golf game with meticulous precision, emphasizing his continuous presence at Barton Creek Country Club from 3:05 p.m. until shortly after 7 p.m. when he departed directly for home. "Your golf partners, Ron Michaels and Peter Drummond, they'll confirm you were with them the entire time?" Detective Sanchez asked, sliding a statement form across the table while maintaining a neutral, almost disinterested expression. Thad nodded confidently, adding that the club staff would also remember serving their group drinks after completing their round. His alibi witnesses neatly lined up to establish his absence from the scene during the window when Elena died. "Feel free to contact them. Ron's actually a partner at my firm, and Peter's been my friend since college," Thad offered, his tone suggesting these connections provided ironclad verification of his whereabouts. The interview's tone shifted subtly as Jackson introduced the first contradiction, mentioning casually that they'd spoken with the country club staff who remembered Thad receiving a phone call and leaving the group around the fourth hole. "They must be confused. Perhaps they're thinking of someone else in our group," Thad replied smoothly, though Jackson noted the slight increase in his blink rate and the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, physiological stress responses that contradicted his verbal dismissal. His attorney shifted slightly in his chair, placing a hand on Thad's forearm in what appeared to be a calming gesture, a movement not lost on the experienced detectives who recognized it as a warning to their client. After 90 minutes of gradually escalating questioning, Detective Jackson deliberately broke the established rhythm by sliding a folder across the table and changing tactics entirely. "Mr. Wilson, are you familiar with the infotainment system in your Tesla Model X?" The question landed like a stone in still water, causing the first visible crack in Thad's composed facade, a momentary widening of the eyes and stillness that spoke volumes to the trained investigators. "It's just the navigation and music system, right?" Thad responded, his voice maintaining steadiness even as his body language betrayed increasing tension. "Actually, it's quite sophisticated," Jackson continued, opening the folder to reveal printed logs from the Tesla's built-in GPS system. "Your vehicle records not only your destinations, but also your routes, stops, and precise timestamps of your movements. Data that's cached in the system's memory, even when destinations aren't actively programmed." The color drained visibly from Thad's face as Jackson methodically laid out time-stamped maps showing the Tesla leaving Barton Creek Country Club at 4:15 p.m., arriving at the Wilson residence at 4:27 p.m., departing again at 5:14 p.m., and returning briefly to the club before heading home at the time Thad claimed to have discovered Elena's body. Thad's attorney immediately intervened. "My client isn't required to explain his vehicle's movements." But the damage was done. The carefully constructed alibi had collapsed under the weight of irrefutable digital evidence. "I may have forgotten making a quick trip home to retrieve some documents for Ron," Thad offered weakly, the improvised explanation landing hollow against the precisely documented 47-minute window during which Elena had been killed. "Montgomery Wilson is going to hear about this harassment," Thad stated, invoking his father's name for the first of what would become 47 references to the former judge during the remainder of the interview. Detective Jackson nodded patiently each time, noting how Thad appeared to believe that his family connections would shield him from the consequences of the mounting evidence. "My father has golf partners on the Texas Supreme Court," Thad added, after Jackson presented evidence of Elena's defensive wounds, as if judicial relationships could somehow alter the forensic reality of his wife's struggle against her killer. The interview's pivotal moment came when Detective Sanchez silently placed a printout of Thad's recovered browser history on the table, searches for fetal homicide sentencing Georgia, pregnant woman fall downstairs accident investigation, and life insurance payout timeline pregnant spouse staring up at him in damning chronological order. These searches were conducted on your laptop over the 3 weeks before Elena's death, Sanchez stated flatly, watching as Thad's attorney physically recoiled from the evidence. "Would you care to explain your research into these specific topics, Mr. Wilson?" For the first time since the interview began, Thad appeared genuinely rattled, his practiced composure crumbling as he looked desperately toward his attorney. This must be some kind of mistake," he stammered, the confident facade giving way to visible panic. I never searched for any of this." His denial lacked the polished certainty of his earlier statements, replaced by fragmented protests that failed to explain how these specific searches appeared in his computer's history in the weeks leading up to Elena's death. "I'm invoking my client's right to remain silent," Thad's attorney interjected firmly, placing a hand on Thad's shoulder to silence his increasingly disjointed explanations. "This interview is over." The tactical retreat came too late. Thad's reaction to the evidence had been recorded and would later prove damning in court, his composed denial of involvement contrasting sharply with his visceral response to the discovery of his digital footprint. As the interview concluded, Detective Jackson informed Thad that he was not free to leave the jurisdiction and would be required to surrender his passport, the first official restriction that signaled the investigation had moved beyond routine questioning into treating him as a suspect. "My father, Montgomery Wilson, he's going to have someone's badge for this," Thad sputtered, as his attorney escorted him from the interview room, his repeated invocations of his father's name becoming almost frantic as the reality of his situation began to sink in. In the observation room, Assistant District Attorney Harper Harris watched the interview's conclusion with the focused intensity of a prosecutor who recognized the foundations of a strong case taking shape. The GPS data alone puts him at the scene during the window of death, but those searches? She shook her head, making notes on a legal pad that would later form the backbone of the state's case against Thad Wilson. Those searches show premeditation and specific intent. He researched how to make it look like an accident and what the consequences would be. Following the interview, Detectives Jackson and Sanchez obtained additional warrants based on the newly discovered evidence, focusing particularly on Thad's financial records and communications with potential accomplices or witnesses. The execution of these warrants revealed another damning detail. Thad had secretly liquidated several investment accounts in the weeks before Elena's death, converting nearly $50,000 to cash through a series of withdrawals carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic bank reporting requirements. The investigation accelerated as digital forensics experts recovered deleted text messages between Thad and a woman named Vanessa Reeves, messages that revealed not only a long-running affair, but also discussions about their future together after Thad was free of his current situation. Most incriminating was a message sent just 2 days before Elena's death, in which Thad assured Vanessa that everything will be resolved soon and that they would have the life we've planned without any complications. By the end of the week, the medical examiner's final report confirmed without equivocation that Elena's death was a homicide, describing in clinical detail the sequence of violence she had endured. Manual strangulation followed by blunt force trauma, consistent with being pushed down the stairs after she was already unconscious or dead. The report specifically noted that the pattern of injuries was entirely inconsistent with an accidental fall, and that the 7-month fetus had died as a direct result of the trauma inflicted on Elena, findings that would later support charges under Texas's fetal homicide statute. 10 days after Elena's death, as her family gathered for her funeral service at a small Catholic church in Austin, Detective Jackson received authorization from the district attorney's office to arrest Thad Wilson on charges of first-degree murder and intentional homicide of an unborn child. The arrest was deliberately timed to occur after the service had concluded, sparing Elena's family the additional trauma of a public confrontation while ensuring media cameras captured Thad being led from his attorney's office in handcuffs. The composed investment banker's carefully constructed image of respectability crumbling as he was processed into the Travis County Jail without bail. The preliminary hearing for the state of Texas versus Thaddeus Montgomery Wilson commenced in a packed Travis County courtroom 21 days after Elena's death, with Assistant District Attorney Harper Harris laying out the prosecution's case before Judge Constance Abernathy. The defendant executed a meticulously planned murder of his pregnant wife, Your Honor, Harris stated, her voice resonating through the hushed courtroom as she methodically presented the evidence that would form the backbone of the state's case. The prosecutor stood beside a large display showing a timeline of Thad's digital activities in the weeks preceding Elena's death, emphasizing the recovered searches that demonstrated both premeditation and awareness of potential legal consequences. Across the courtroom, Thad sat beside his defense team, now expanded to include a high-profile attorney from Houston who specialized in capital cases, a telling upgrade from his father's former law partner who had represented him initially. The defendant maintained a deliberately somber expression throughout the proceedings, occasionally leaning to whisper to his attorneys, but otherwise presenting the carefully cultivated image of a grieving husband wrongfully accused. This performance contrasted sharply with the testimony of the first responders who described finding him at the scene showing minimal emotional distress and no physical signs consistent with his claim of having attempted CPR on his wife. Digital forensics expert Dr. Elaine Park took the stand to explain how Thad's deleted browser history had been recovered from his laptop's unallocated disk space, presenting the court with a chronological log of searches that painted a damning picture of premeditation. These searches show a clear progression, Dr. Park testified, highlighting how the defendant had first researched divorce laws regarding pregnant women in Texas, then progressed to inquiries about accidents involving pregnant women, and finally focused specifically on how such deaths would be investigated. The expert further testified that attempts had been made to permanently erase this browsing history using specialized software that had been downloaded just 2 days before Elena's death, software that itself had been downloaded after searches for how to permanently delete browser history. The prosecution's case strengthened considerably when Detective Jackson testified about the Tesla's GPS data, presenting the court with detailed maps and timestamps that placed Thad at the scene during the exact window when Elena had been killed. The vehicle's infotainment system caches this data automatically, Jackson explained, showing how the logs contradicted Thad's initial alibi claim of being at the golf course continuously throughout the afternoon. Most damning was the precise 47-minute window during which the Tesla was parked at the Wilson residence, a time frame that perfectly aligned with the medical examiner's estimated time of death. Perhaps the most powerful moment of the preliminary hearing came when Sophia D'Angelo Chen, Elena's sister, testified about receiving a package from Elena just 1 day after her death. A package postmarked 3 days before the murder containing a USB drive with a handwritten note reading, "Only open if something happens to me." Visibly emotional but composed, Sophia described how the drive contained meticulously organized documentation of Thad's increasingly controlling behavior, screenshots of monitoring software he had installed on her devices, recordings of verbal abuse, and a detailed timeline of his escalating jealousy and isolation tactics. Elena told me she was afraid, but not that he would kill her. She thought he was too concerned with appearances to risk violence, Sophia testified, her voice breaking as she recounted their final conversation just hours before Elena's death. She called me to say she'd told Thad she was leaving him after the baby was born and that she wanted to raise their son with my help. She said he'd gone completely silent, just staring at her before walking out to his golf game. This testimony established both motive and the crucial final trigger that had pushed Thad to act, Elena's declaration of independence and her plan to share custody of their son with her sister rather than allowing Thad complete control. The court fell silent as the prosecution played a video file from the USB drive, a secretly recorded conversation in which Thad could be heard telling Elena that she would never take his son away from him and that he would rather see them both dead than lose control of his family. Thad visibly flinched at the recording while his attorneys frantically scribbled notes, clearly blindsided by evidence they hadn't anticipated. Judge Abernathy's expression remained impassive, but the court reporter briefly paused in her typing, the threat's chilling clarity affecting even the most professionally detached participants in the proceedings. The financial motive behind Elena's murder emerged through testimony from insurance investigator Marcus Webb, who detailed the $2 million life insurance policy Thad had taken out on Elena just 6 weeks before her death. The defendant specifically inquired about whether the policy would cover accidental death during pregnancy and how quickly claims would be processed, Webb testified, noting that such specific inquiries were unusual enough that he had documented them in his client notes. The investigator further revealed that Thad had attempted to file a claim on the policy the very day after Elena's funeral, citing urgent financial needs related to funeral expenses, despite his multi-million-dollar investment portfolio. The prosecution's case took an unexpected turn when Detective Sanchez revealed that digital forensics had recovered deleted text messages between Thad and his mistress, Vanessa Reeves, discussing their plans for a future together after he was free of his marriage. Ms. Reeves has agreed to cooperate with the investigation, Sanchez testified, explaining that the mistress had initially believed Thad's claims that his marriage was already effectively over and that he and Elena were quietly separating after the baby's birth. When presented with evidence of Thad's deception, Vanessa had provided investigators with additional messages and recordings that further demonstrated his determination to end his marriage by any means necessary. The preliminary hearing's most dramatic revelation came when the prosecution disclosed that Beckett Ashford, Thad's younger brother, had approached investigators voluntarily after learning the details of Elena's death. Mr. Ashford has provided a sworn statement indicating that his brother contacted him immediately after Elena's death, seeking assistance in establishing his alibi, Harper Harris informed the court, the gallery erupting in murmurs at this betrayal within the Wilson family. Beckett's statement detailed how Thad had asked him to confirm they had spoken by phone during the critical time window, a conversation that had never occurred, and had suggested specific details to include in any police interview to support Thad's version of events. As the hearing progressed into its second day, forensic pathologist Dr. Vivian Chen provided detailed testimony about Elena's injuries, using anatomical diagrams to illustrate the sequence of violence that had ended her life. The victim sustained manual strangulation sufficient to render her unconscious or dead before the fall down the stairs, Dr. Chen testified, pointing to the distinctive bruising patterns on Elena's neck that matched the size and spacing of male hands. The pathologist further noted that microscopic analysis of the bruises indicated they had been inflicted while Elena's heart was still beating, contradicting Thad's claim that he had found her already deceased from an accidental fall. The prosecution's presentation culminated with Detective Jackson's testimony regarding a single cut found on Thad's hand, a wound he had claimed resulted from breaking a glass while calling 911, but which forensic analysis determined was consistent with a defensive wound caused by the victim's fingernails during a struggle. The DNA analysis of tissue recovered from beneath Ms. D'Angelo Ashford's broken fingernails matches the defendant's DNA profile, Jackson stated, explaining how this physical evidence directly connected Thad to a violent struggle with his wife, rather than the discovery of an accident, as he had claimed. By the hearing's conclusion, Judge Abernathy found sufficient probable cause to bind Thad over for trial on charges of first-degree murder, intentional homicide of an unborn child, and insurance fraud. The latter charge added based on his attempt to collect on the recently purchased life insurance policy. The evidence presented by the state demonstrates not only opportunity and means, the judge stated gravely, but a level of premeditation and calculation that warrants the full weight of judicial scrutiny. Bail was denied based on both the severity of the charges and evidence that Thad had been liquidating assets that could facilitate flight from justice. As Thad was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, the reality of his situation appeared to finally penetrate his composed facade, his face ashen as he glanced toward the gallery where his parents sat in rigid silence, his father's judicial connections proving powerless against the mounting evidence of his son's calculated violence. In the hallway outside, Vincent and Gabriella D'Angelo stood with their surviving daughter Sophia, their faces reflecting not only grief for Elena and her unborn son, but grim determination to see justice served for the lives so callously extinguished by a man who had viewed his wife and child as possessions rather than people. The media coverage of the preliminary hearing focused intensely on the contrast between Thad's carefully cultivated public image as a successful professional and devoted husband-to-be, and the emerging evidence of his controlling, manipulative nature. Local news outlets ran side-by-side images of the smiling couple at charity events alongside the timeline of Thad's incriminating searches, creating a visual narrative of deception that captured public attention and turned the case into a national story about the sometimes lethal consequences of narcissistic entitlement. The Travis County Grand Jury convened in the third week of April 2023, their proceedings shrouded in the requisite secrecy as Assistant District Attorney Harper Harris presented the state's evidence against Thaddeus Montgomery Wilson. For 3 days, the 23 jurors heard testimony from key witnesses and reviewed the substantial physical and digital evidence that had been collected since Elena's death. This case represents premeditated murder in its most calculated form, Harris told the grand jury in her closing statement, emphasizing the documented progression of Thad's research into methods of killing his pregnant wife while making it appear accidental. On April 21, 2023, the grand jury returned a true bill, formally indicting Thad on 7 counts: first-degree murder, intentional homicide of an unborn child, tampering with evidence, insurance fraud, obstruction of justice, domestic abuse, and stalking. The multiple charges reflected the prosecutor's strategy of addressing every aspect of Thad's actions, from the planning stages through the killing itself and his subsequent attempts to cover up the crime and profit from it. Each charge represents a distinct violation of law, Harris explained to reporters gathered outside the courthouse, and collectively, they tell the story of a man who believed his control over his wife was more important than her life or the life of their unborn child. Within the sterile confines of the Travis County Correctional Complex, Thad received the news of his indictment with the first visible cracks in his composed facade, his attorney later describing him as stunned by the extent of the charges. The reality of his situation, facing not just murder charges but a comprehensive case that addressed every aspect of his calculated actions, appeared to finally penetrate the narcissistic shell that had thus far protected him from fully acknowledging the gravity of his position. During a brief meeting with his parents in the jail's visitation area, surveillance cameras captured Thad attempting to convince his father to use his judicial connections to influence the case, a conversation that would later surface during trial as further evidence of his belief that rules and laws applied differently to him because of his family's status. The prosecution's case strengthened considerably when Vanessa Reeves, Thad's mistress, agreed to formal cooperation in exchange for immunity from any accessory charges that might arise from her knowledge of Thad's plans. Ms. Reeves initially believed Mr. Wilson's claims that his marriage was already functionally over, explained Detective Sanchez during a case briefing, but became concerned when he began discussing specifics of how convenient it would be if his pregnant wife were no longer in the picture. Most significantly, Vanessa revealed that in the weeks before Elena's death, Thad had asked hypothetical questions about how deaths during pregnancy were investigated and whether police could recover deleted computer searches, questions she had found strange enough to document in her personal journal. The most unexpected development in the prosecution's building case came when an undercover officer in the jail reported that Thad had approached another inmate about potentially bribing the medical examiner to modify findings in his autopsy report. This inmate, Jason Mercer, agreed to wear a recording device during subsequent conversations with Thad, capturing explicit discussions about how much it might cost to have certain findings reinterpreted to support an accidental death determination. He thought he was talking to someone with connections to organized crime, Detective Jackson explained to the prosecution team, but instead he was detailing his plans to a confidential informant who recorded every word. By early May, the prosecution had assembled a case file exceeding 2,000 pages, documenting every aspect of Thad's actions before, during, and after Elena's murder. Digital forensics experts recovered additional deleted evidence from Thad's devices, including emails to offshore financial entities inquiring about establishing accounts that would be inaccessible to potential civil litigation. Emails sent just days after he had purchased the life insurance policy on Elena. Analysts also discovered that Thad had researched countries without extradition treaties with the United States, focusing particularly on locations that offered investment visa programs for wealthy foreigners. The defense team, now led by prominent criminal attorney Douglas Swanson, filed a motion to suppress the Tesla GPS data, arguing that accessing the vehicle's cached location information constituted an unreasonable search requiring a specific warrant. Judge Abernathy scheduled a suppression hearing for June 1st, setting the stage for a crucial legal battle over what had become one of the prosecution's strongest pieces of evidence linking Thad to the scene during the precise window when Elena was killed. The defense is attempting to exclude the very evidence that destroys their client's alibi, Harris observed to her trial team during preparation for the hearing, recognizing that without the GPS data, reasonable doubt might be easier to establish. The D'Angelo family continued their painful journey through grief, while simultaneously preparing to testify in the upcoming trial, with Sophia taking temporary guardianship of Elena's personal effects, including journals that revealed the extent of psychological abuse she had endured during her marriage. She documented everything, Sophia told Detective Jackson during a follow-up interview, providing investigators with Elena's personal calendar that noted incidents of Thad's controlling behavior, from checking her phone while she showered to questioning her about male colleagues with whom she had perfectly innocent professional interactions. These contemporaneous records would prove invaluable in establishing the pattern of coercive control that had preceded the physical violence of the murder. On June 1st, the courtroom was filled to capacity for the suppression hearing, with legal observers recognizing the potentially precedent-setting nature of the arguments regarding digital privacy and vehicle data. Defense attorney Swanson argued passionately that accessing the Tesla's cached location data without a warrant specifically identifying that information source constituted an unreasonable search under the Fourth Amendment. My client had a reasonable expectation of privacy regarding his vehicle's internal data storage, Swanson contended, citing recent Supreme Court decisions regarding cellular location data. Prosecutor Harris countered with a methodical rebuttal, demonstrating that the initial search warrant had explicitly included all digital devices capable of location tracking, and arguing that modern vehicles with integrated computing systems fell squarely within that definition. The defendant's Tesla is effectively a computer on wheels, Your Honor, Harris explained, presenting affidavits from automotive technology experts confirming that modern vehicles' infotainment systems function as full computers that happen to be installed in cars rather than on desks. Judge Abernathy, after considering both arguments, denied the suppression motion, ruling that the original warrant's language was sufficiently broad to encompass vehicle data systems, a critical victory for the prosecution that preserved their timeline evidence. As pretrial preparations intensified, a startling development emerged when Beckett Ashford, Thad's younger brother, approached the district attorney's office with a proposal. He would agree to wear a recording device during jail visits with his brother in exchange for immunity from any accessory charges that might arise from their initial conversations after Elena's death. I can't live with what he did, Beckett explained during his recorded statement, revealing that Thad had called him immediately after Elena's death, asking for help establishing an alibi before any public announcement that foul play was suspected, a request that had initially confused Beckett, but later horrified him as the truth emerged. The prosecution's decision to accept Beckett's offer introduced a powerful new dimension to their case, as Thad, believing his brother remained loyal, spoke candidly during their monitored jail meetings about the need to stay on the same page regarding their communications on the day of Elena's death. "You need to remember we talked at exactly 4:45, Thad was recorded instructing his brother, unaware that this fabricated conversation was being documented as consciousness of guilt. If they ask specifically, you called me about Dad's birthday plans while I was at the clubhouse bar after golf. By late June, the prosecution's case had been further strengthened by laboratory analysis of the blood evidence found in the master bathroom drain trap, confirming it matched Elena's DNA profile and contained microscopic fibers consistent with the cleaning products found in the home. This physical evidence supported the theory that Thad had attempted to clean up evidence of the struggle before staging the body at the bottom of the stairs, a level of calculation that belied any claim of accidental death or heat-of-the-moment violence. The final pretrial bombshell came when jail officials intercepted communications suggesting Thad was attempting to arrange for a white supremacist gang member to intimidate or harm Harper Harris's teenage daughter, a discovery that resulted in additional federal charges and Thad's transfer to maximum security status. He genuinely believes he can manipulate or threaten his way out of consequences, Harris remarked to Detective Jackson after being briefed on the intercepted communications. The prosecutor's determination to secure justice visibly strengthened by this attempt to target her family. As the summer of 2023 progressed toward the scheduled September trial date, public interest in the case intensified, with national media outlets producing specials examining the psychological dynamics of controlling relationships and the sometimes lethal consequences when such control is threatened. Elena's story became emblematic of the invisible escalation that often precedes domestic homicide, with experts noting how Thad's behavior had followed the classic pattern of isolation, surveillance, and psychological manipulation before culminating in physical violence when his control was irrevocably threatened by Elena's decision to leave. The prosecution and defense teams engaged in the ritual dance of plea negotiations, with Harris authorized to offer second-degree murder with a 30-year minimum sentence, an offer Thad rejected outright, maintaining his innocence despite the mounting evidence. "My client maintains that his wife's death was a tragic accident," Swanson stated to reporters, "and we look forward to presenting the full context of their relationship at trial." This context, the defense attorney suggested, would include evidence of Elena's emotional instability during pregnancy, a victim-blaming strategy that drew immediate criticism from domestic violence advocates and further alienated potential jurors in the court of public opinion. By the final pre-trial hearing in late August, Judge Abernathy had ruled on all outstanding motions, allowing most of the prosecution's evidence while excluding certain character testimony about Thad's previous relationships that was deemed more prejudicial than probative. With jury selection scheduled to begin on September 5, 2023, both the prosecution and defense teams made their final preparations for a trial that promised to be both legally complex and emotionally charged, a public reckoning not just for Thaddeus Montgomery Wilson, but for the broader social failures that allow controlling behavior to escalate to deadly violence. The state of Texas versus Thaddeus Montgomery Wilson trial began on a crisp September morning in 2023, with potential jurors filing into the Travis County Courthouse under the watchful eyes of heightened security, a precaution implemented after Thad's attempt to orchestrate intimidation of the prosecutor's daughter from jail. The jury selection process proved lengthy and contentious, with defense attorney Douglas Swanson seeking to exclude potential jurors who had personal experience with domestic violence or controlling relationships, arguing such experiences would prejudice them against his client. "We're looking for jurors who can approach this case with genuine neutrality," Swanson argued during sidebar discussions with Judge Abernathy, while prosecutor Harper Harris countered that excluding anyone with knowledge of domestic abuse dynamics would artificially skew the jury pool. After 4 days of intensive voir dire, a jury of 9 women and 3 men was seated, their demographics reflecting Austin's diversity, while their backgrounds, including a software engineer, a retired teacher, a nurse, a construction manager, and an accounting professional, suggested the analytical capacity to evaluate the complex digital evidence central to the prosecution's case. 2 alternate jurors were also selected, a standard precaution for a trial expected to last at least 3 weeks and potentially involve emotionally challenging testimony about violence against a pregnant victim. The trial formally opened on September 11, 2023, with Judge Constance Abernathy addressing the jury about their responsibilities and the mechanics of the trial process before turning the floor over to the prosecution for opening statements. Assistant District Attorney Harper Harris approached the jury box with measured steps, her demeanor projecting both gravity and determination as she established the framework through which the state intended to prove Thad's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. This case will take you on a journey through a marriage that appeared perfect from the outside but contained a terrible secret, Harris began, her voice steady as she outlined how control and ownership, not love, had defined Thad's relationship with Elena. Using a large digital display visible to both the jury and the gallery, Harris presented a timeline that began months before the murder, highlighting the progression of Thad's controlling behavior from subtle monitoring of Elena's communications to the final fatal violence when she attempted to reclaim her autonomy. The evidence will show that when the defendant could no longer control his wife through psychological means, when she discovered his affair and decided to leave him, he made the calculated decision that if he couldn't possess her and their unborn son, no one would. The prosecutor methodically previewed the state's key evidence, the Tesla GPS data, placing Thad at the scene, the damning browser history revealing his research into killing methods, the life insurance policy, and the recorded conversations with his brother and mistress, demonstrating consciousness of guilt. Defense attorney Douglas Swanson's opening statement presented a starkly different narrative, portraying Thad as a devoted husband, navigating a troubled marriage with a wife experiencing pregnancy-related emotional instability. What the prosecution describes as control, the evidence will show, was my client's desperate attempt to manage an increasingly volatile home situation, Swanson claimed, suggesting that Elena's hormonal changes had resulted in unpredictable behavior and fabricated abuse allegations. This victim-blaming approach drew visible reactions from Elena's family seated in the front row of the gallery, with Sophia D'Angelo Chen clutching her mother's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. Swanson focused particularly on creating alternative explanations for the digital evidence, suggesting that Thad's internet searches were related to a crime novel he had been outlining as a hobby project, and that the Tesla's GPS data reflected a brief, innocuous trip home that Thad had simply forgotten when initially questioned by police. Memory is fallible under stress, the defense attorney reminded jurors, and the prosecution has constructed an elaborate theory based on normal memory inconsistencies following a traumatic discovery. This framing attempted to neutralize the damaging timeline contradictions that form the backbone of the state's case. The prosecution's case began with first responders who had arrived at the Wilson home on the evening of March 15, 2023, their testimony establishing the scene and Thad's demeanor upon their arrival. Paramedic Jessica Morales described finding Elena's body positioned at the bottom of the stairs, noting that despite Thad's claim of performing CPR, there were no signs of chest compression such as displaced clothing or the expected positioning of the body. In my experience, when someone has genuinely attempted CPR, there are visible indicators. The victim's clothing is typically disheveled, and they're usually positioned flat on their back, Morales testified, adding that Elena's body had been found in a position inconsistent with both an accidental fall and resuscitation attempts. Austin Police Officer Trevor Johnson, the first law enforcement officer to arrive at the scene, testified about Thad's unnaturally calm demeanor, describing how the defendant had recited the events leading to his discovery of Elena's body with a precision that seemed rehearsed rather than the disjointed narrative typically provided by individuals in genuine shock. He spoke about finding his wife's body the way someone might describe discovering a plumbing leak, factual, sequential, and completely devoid of the emotional distress I typically observe in similar situations, Officer Johnson stated, his testimony drawing an objection from the defense that was overruled when the prosecution established the officer's 15 years of experience responding to death scenes. The trial's focus sharpened dramatically when Detective James Jackson took the stand. The lead investigator's testimony spanning 2 full days as he methodically outlined the evolution of the case from initial response to Thad's arrest. Using the courtroom's large display screen, Jackson presented the jury with a detailed breakdown of the Tesla's GPS data, showing precisely how Thad's vehicle had left the country club during his supposed golf game, returned to the residence during the exact window when Elena was killed, then returned to the club before coming home at the time he reported finding her body. The Tesla's infotainment system caches location data automatically, Jackson explained, walking the jury through the technical details of how this information was recovered and verified by automotive technology experts. The detective presented maps showing Thad's actual movements overlaid with his claimed alibi, the stark contradiction visible to everyone in the courtroom. This isn't a matter of confused recollection or stress-induced memory lapse, Jackson testified, addressing the defense's opening statement directly. This is a deliberate, detailed fabrication designed to place the defendant away from the scene during the precisely established time of his wife's murder. The defense's cross-examination attempted to undermine the GPS evidence by suggesting potential technical glitches or unauthorized use of the vehicle, but Jackson's testimony remained unshaken as he explained the multiple verification methods used to confirm the data's accuracy and the security features that prevented anyone but Thad from operating the vehicle. The Tesla's security system logs all access events, Jackson noted, presenting records showing that no one but Thad had unlocked or driven the car on the day of Elena's death. Digital forensics expert Dr. Elaine Park provided what many observers later described as the most damaging testimony against Thad, presenting the jury with a chronological display of his browser searches in the weeks leading up to Elena's death. The large courtroom screen displayed search queries that painted an unmistakable picture of premeditation. Fetal homicide sentencing Georgia, pregnant woman fall down stairs accident investigation, and life insurance payout timeline pregnant spouse appeared in stark text alongside their timestamps, each search visibly connecting to the next in a progression that suggested methodical planning rather than random curiosity. The defendant attempted to permanently delete these searches using specialized software, Dr. Park testified, explaining how the data had nonetheless been recovered from unallocated disk space on Thad's laptop. This wasn't standard browser history clearing. This was the use of a dedicated tool designed to overwrite data to prevent forensic recovery, software that was itself downloaded after searches for methods to permanently erase digital evidence. This testimony directly contradicted the defense's claim that the searches were innocent research for a writing project, as the deliberate attempt to conceal them suggested consciousness of their incriminating nature. The prosecution's presentation of physical evidence continued with testimony from forensic pathologist Dr. Vivian Chen, who used anatomical diagrams to illustrate the sequence of violence that had ended Elena's life. The victim sustained manual strangulation sufficient to render her unconscious or dead before the fall down the stairs, Dr. Chen testified, pointing to the distinctive bruising patterns on Elena's neck that matched the size and spacing of male hands. Large photographs displayed on the courtroom screen showed the bruising in clinical detail, while Dr. Chen explained how the coloration and tissue damage indicated the injuries had been inflicted while Elena was still alive. Dr. Chen's testimony became particularly powerful when she addressed the condition of the 28-week-old male fetus, explaining that the unborn child had been healthy and viable before the attack on his mother. Based on the autopsy findings, this fetus was developing normally and would likely have survived if born at that stage of pregnancy with appropriate medical intervention, the pathologist stated, her professional demeanor momentarily softening as she described the child's fully formed features. This testimony visibly affected several jurors, with one male juror briefly removing his glasses to wipe his eyes, while a female juror stared fixedly at Thad with an expression of undisguised contempt. The prosecution's case gained emotional resonance through Sophia D'Angelo Chen's testimony about receiving the USB drive Elena had mailed shortly before her death, containing documentation of Thad's controlling behavior and a video message expressing her fears. She told me she was finally leaving him after the baby was born, Sophia testified, her voice steady despite her evident grief. She said Thad had become increasingly paranoid about losing control of her, checking her phone constantly and isolating her from friends and family. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecution played Elena's video message, her face filling the large display screen as she spoke directly to her sister from what appeared to be her car, presumably one of the few places she felt safe from Thad's surveillance. "If you're watching this, something has happened to me," Elena began, her voice calm despite the chilling implication of her words. "I don't think Thad would actually hurt me, but I need to document what's been happening in case I'm wrong." The jury watched intently as Elena detailed specific incidents of controlling behavior, from Thad monitoring her location through phone tracking to his explosive anger when she questioned expenses related to his affair. As the first week of trial concluded, the prosecution had established a compelling narrative of premeditation and calculation, supported by an array of digital, physical, and testimonial evidence that left the defense fighting an increasingly uphill battle. The weekend break would give jurors time to process the emotionally charged testimony they had heard, while both legal teams prepared for the trial's second phase, which would feature testimony from Thad's brother Beckett and his mistress, Vanessa Reeves, witnesses whose cooperation with the prosecution had introduced some of the most damning evidence against the defendant. The trial's second week began with testimony from Dr. Rachel Winters, the obstetrician who had been overseeing Elena's pregnancy, whose evidence directly contradicted the defense's narrative about pregnancy-related emotional instability. Elena D'Angelo Ashford was experiencing a textbook healthy pregnancy with no indications of hormonal imbalances or mood disturbances beyond what would be considered entirely normal, Dr. Winters testified, referring to detailed medical records that documented Elena's physical and emotional well-being throughout her prenatal care. The doctor described Elena as thoughtful and well-prepared for motherhood, noting that she had attended every scheduled appointment, completed recommended prenatal classes, and asked appropriate questions about infant care and development. When questioned specifically about Elena's mental state, Dr. Winters recounted a concerning pattern she had observed during the final trimester. In her last two visits, Elena appeared increasingly isolated and anxious, mentioning that her husband was very particular about her activities and diet during pregnancy. This testimony revealed that Elena had confided about Thad's controlling behavior becoming more pronounced as her due date approached, including his insistence on attending every medical appointment and answering questions directed at Elena, behavior the doctor had found concerning enough to make note of in her files. "I actually provided Elena with domestic violence resources during her last visit, concealing the information in her prenatal vitamin samples because she seemed afraid to take any printed materials home," Dr. Winters stated, her professional composure momentarily cracking as she acknowledged her unsuccessful attempt to help. The prosecution's case gained considerable strength through the testimony of Beckett Ashford, Thad's younger brother, whose decision to cooperate with investigators had yielded crucial evidence of consciousness of guilt. Taking the stand with visible reluctance, Beckett avoided eye contact with his brother while describing the phone call he had received from Thad shortly after Elena's death. "He called me before there was any public announcement about Elena's death being suspicious," Beckett testified, and immediately started establishing what he called our timeline for that day, insisting we had spoken by phone at specific times that we hadn't actually talked. Prosecutor Harris played recordings of jail conversations between the brothers, obtained through Beckett's cooperation with investigators, in which Thad could be heard coaching his brother on specific details to include in any police interviews. "You need to remember we talked at exactly 4:45, Thad's voice instructed from the courtroom speakers, and that I mentioned being at the clubhouse with Ron and Peter. Beckett identified his brother's voice and confirmed the accuracy of the recording, explaining that these fabricated conversations were designed to support Thad's false alibi by placing him at the country club during the time of Elena's murder. The most dramatic testimony came when Beckett revealed that Thad had confided his mounting financial troubles in the months before Elena's death, describing how his brother had complained about the financial disaster Elena's pregnancy would cause, given his hidden debt from maintaining both his lifestyle and his affair with Vanessa. He said having a child would lock him down financially for decades when he was already struggling to maintain appearances, Beckett stated, revealing a financial motive that complemented the control-based psychological motive the prosecution had established. When I suggested he simply divorce Elena after the baby was born, he said that would be financial suicide because of Texas community property laws. Cross-examination by defense attorney Swanson attempted to portray Beckett as a jealous younger brother, motivated by long-standing sibling rivalry, suggesting he had fabricated or exaggerated conversations to gain favor with prosecutors. "Isn't it true that you've always resented your brother's success?" Swanson asked, his tone implying Beckett's testimony stemmed from envy rather than truth. The attack strategy backfired when Beckett responded with quiet dignity. "I loved my brother, Mr. Swanson, which is why I initially tried to believe his version of events despite my doubts, but I couldn't continue protecting someone who would murder his pregnant wife because she threatened his sense of control and his finances." The trial's emotional temperature rose further with testimony from Montgomery Wilson, Thad's father, and former state appeals court judge, whose appearance had been compelled by prosecution subpoena after he initially refused voluntary cooperation. The elder Wilson's attempt to invoke judicial privilege to avoid testifying about conversations with his son was firmly rejected by Judge Abernathy, who reminded him that no such privilege existed in criminal proceedings involving family members unless they had an established attorney-client relationship, which Montgomery Wilson had not formally established with his son, despite his legal background. Visibly uncomfortable on the witness stand, Montgomery Wilson presented as a man torn between family loyalty and legal obligation, his testimony revealing the extent to which the Wilson family had enabled Thad's sense of entitlement throughout his life. "Yes, I contacted several former colleagues on the bench after Thad's arrest," the former judge admitted under direct examination, confirming he had attempted to leverage his judicial connections to influence the case's handling. When pressed about his knowledge of Thad's controlling behavior toward Elena, Montgomery Wilson's testimony became evasive, prompting Judge Abernathy to remind him of his oath to provide truthful and complete answers. The prosecution's strategy of demonstrating Thad's pattern of controlling behavior gained additional support through testimony from Elena's colleagues at the architectural firm where she had worked until taking maternity leave. Senior architect Margaret Chen described how Thad would frequently appear unannounced at company functions or lunch meetings, ostensibly to surprise his wife, but effectively monitoring her interactions. Elena gradually stopped attending optional work events, Chen testified, explaining that Thad needed to approve her schedule in advance and became upset when she made spontaneous plans. Financial evidence revealed another dimension of control when forensic accountant Timothy Bowers testified about his analysis of the Wilson household finances, demonstrating how Thad had systematically restricted Elena's financial independence despite her professional income. Ms. D'Angelo Ashford's salary was deposited directly into accounts controlled exclusively by her husband, Bowers explained, showing documentation of how Elena had been limited to a monitored allowance account and required to provide receipts for purchases exceeding $100, a control mechanism commonly observed in financially abusive relationships. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecution presented evidence regarding the life insurance policy Thad had purchased on Elena just 6 weeks before her death, with insurance agent Marcus Webb testifying about Thad's unusual interest in the claim process and payout timing. Mr. Wilson specifically asked multiple questions about how claims are investigated in cases of accidental death during pregnancy, Webb stated, consulting his client notes from their meetings. He was particularly interested in whether the company had different investigation protocols for deaths occurring in the home versus public locations. Perhaps the most disturbing testimony came from Vanessa Reeves, Thad's mistress, who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors after learning the full circumstances of Elena's death. Appearing visibly uncomfortable on the stand, Vanessa described how her relationship with Thad had evolved from a professional connection to an affair that he had characterized as an inevitable transition, given his supposedly failing marriage. He told me Elena had become obsessed with the pregnancy to the point of neglecting their relationship, Vanessa testified. But I later discovered he was telling Elena he was working late when he was actually with me. The prosecution played recorded conversations obtained after Vanessa began cooperating with investigators, including one particularly damning exchange where Thad discussed potentially bribing the medical examiner to modify findings in the autopsy report. He called it investing in a favorable interpretation, Vanessa explained, identifying Thad's voice on the recording as he detailed how such arrangements could be made through intermediaries to maintain deniability. This evidence directly contradicted the defense's portrayal of Thad as a grieving husband wrongfully accused, instead revealing his active efforts to manipulate the investigation through corruption. The medical aspects of the case were further developed through testimony from neuropsychologist Dr. Nathan Rivera, who specialized in domestic violence dynamics and explained the concept of coercive control to the jury, the pattern of behavior through which abusers gradually isolate, monitor, and dominate their partners. What we see in this case is a textbook progression from psychological control to physical violence triggered by the victim's attempt to reclaim autonomy, Dr. Rivera testified, connecting Thad's documented behavior to established patterns identified in research on intimate partner homicide. The prosecution's medical evidence culminated with detailed testimony from Dr. Vivian Chen about the 28-week-old male fetus, whose development she described with scientific precision, while maintaining the dignity appropriate for discussing a human life that had been extinguished before birth. Based on the autopsy findings, this was a perfectly healthy male fetus who would have had excellent survival prospects if delivered at that gestational age, Dr. Chen stated, explaining that modern neonatal intensive care units routinely save infants born at 28 weeks with minimal long-term complications. This testimony proved particularly powerful when Dr. Chen displayed sonogram images from Elena's medical records, showing the developed features of the fetus that Elena and her family had already named Alexander Vincent D'Angelo Ashford. Several jurors visibly reacted to these images, with 2 female jurors wiping tears as Dr. Chen explained that the fetus had died from maternal trauma rather than any medical condition, a preventable death resulting directly from the violence inflicted on Elena. As the trial's second week concluded, the prosecution had methodically established not only Thad's presence at the scene during the time of Elena's death, contradicting his alibi, but also the calculated nature of his actions, before, during, and after the murder. The defense's initial narrative of pregnancy-related emotional instability had been thoroughly undermined by medical testimony, while the portrayal of Thad as a devoted husband had collapsed under the weight of evidence demonstrating his controlling behavior, financial deceptions, and active efforts to manipulate the investigation. With the prosecution's case nearing its conclusion, legal observers noted the mounting challenge facing defense attorney Douglas Swanson, whose options for creating reasonable doubt appeared increasingly limited as each day added new dimensions to the evidence against his client. The trial had become not just a legal proceeding, but a public reckoning with the dynamics of controlling relationships and the sometimes fatal consequences when such control is threatened by a partner's attempt to reclaim their autonomy. The trial's third week opened with the prosecution's presentation of digital forensics expert Cameron Zhao, whose testimony focused on Elena's phone, a device that had been found in an unusual location and appeared to have been reset to factory settings after her death. The defendant claimed his wife had misplaced her phone, but our analysis indicates it had been deliberately placed in a kitchen drawer and reset at approximately 7:05 p.m. on the evening of her death, Zhao testified, explaining how cloud backups and telecommunications records had allowed investigators to determine the precise timing of these actions despite the phone's reset status. Using the courtroom's display screens, Zhao demonstrated how location data recovered from Google's servers showed Elena's phone had remained stationary in the master bedroom from approximately 3:30 p.m. until 7:02 p.m., when it suddenly moved to the kitchen area, a movement that occurred after the medical examiner's established time of death, but before Thad claimed to have discovered her body. Most significantly, Zhao continued, we recovered partial fingerprints from the phone screen and case that matched the defendant, despite his initial statement that he hadn't handled his wife's phone that day. This evidence directly contradicted Thad's claim of discovering Elena's body immediately upon returning home, suggesting instead that he had taken time to methodically manipulate the scene before calling 911. The prosecution further strengthened its case through testimony from Austin Police Department crime scene technician Alicia Dominguez, who had processed the Wilson home in the hours after Elena's death. We discovered blood evidence in locations inconsistent with a simple fall down the stairs, Dominguez explained, presenting photographs of microscopic blood spatter on the master bedroom wall and blood residue in the bathroom sink drain that had been partially cleaned. Using the courtroom's large display, Dominguez walked the jury through a forensic reconstruction of the likely sequence of events: an initial assault in the bedroom, strangulation to unconsciousness or death, and then transportation of Elena's body to the staircase where it was positioned to suggest an accidental fall. The courtroom fell silent as Dominguez presented evidence recovered from beneath Elena's fingernails, skin cells, containing DNA that matched Thad's genetic profile, along with fibers from the cashmere sweater he had been wearing when police arrived. These findings indicate the victim fought back against her attacker, Dominguez testified, explaining how the distinctive pattern of Elena's broken nails suggested a defensive struggle rather than damage from a fall. Most damning was Dominguez's testimony about a single cut on Thad's hand that he had claimed resulted from breaking a drinking glass while calling 911, a wound that forensic analysis determined was consistent with a defensive injury inflicted by someone's fingernails during a struggle. The prosecution's case gained additional dimension through testimony from Dr. Lydia Fernandez, a domestic violence specialist who had analyzed the documentation found on the USB drive Elena had mailed to her sister shortly before her death. Ms. D'Angelo Ashford maintained meticulous records of escalating controlling behavior, Dr. Fernandez testified, presenting a categorized timeline of incidents Elena had documented over the 6 months preceding her death. This pattern shows textbook progression from isolation tactics to surveillance to financial control, culminating in physical intimidation when these mechanisms of control were threatened by the victim's discovered intention to leave. Dr. Fernandez's testimony became particularly powerful when she explained the significance of Elena's preparations to leave after the baby's birth, rather than immediately upon discovering Thad's affair. Research consistently shows that the period of highest lethality risk in controlling relationships is during separation, particularly when the controlling partner becomes aware of concrete leaving plans, the expert explained, connecting Elena's calculated decision to wait until after delivery to Thad's sudden escalation to violence when this plan was revealed. Ms. D'Angelo Ashford appears to have correctly assessed that her husband's controlling behavior posed a risk, hence her documentation and secret planning, but she likely underestimated how severely he would react to losing control of both her and their child. The prosecution's presentation of financial evidence revealed another dimension of Thad's premeditation through testimony from forensic accountant Maria Sullivan, who had analyzed his complex financial maneuvering in the weeks before Elena's death. The defendant established a series of offshore accounts accessible only to him, transferring approximately $220,000 through structured transactions designed to avoid detection, Sullivan testified, presenting documentation of wire transfers to entities in jurisdictions known for banking secrecy. This evidence suggested not only financial motive, but preparation for potential flight, further undermining the defense's portrayal of Thad as a devoted husband caught in a tragic circumstance. Perhaps the most dramatic testimony came when the prosecution called Jason Mercer, the jail informant who had recorded conversations with Thad about potentially bribing the medical examiner and intimidating witnesses. Initially introduced to Thad as someone with connections to organized crime, Mercer had agreed to cooperate with investigators after learning the full nature of the charges against his fellow inmate. He approached me because he'd heard I had connections outside, Mercer testified, explaining how Thad had gradually revealed his plans to manipulate the case through financial incentives to key witnesses and experts. The courtroom speakers played recorded conversations in which Thad could be heard discussing specific amounts for potential bribes and the best methods to communicate offers without creating evidence. We need to make sure the ME understands there's significant appreciation for a finding that supports accidental death, Thad's voice stated clearly in one recording, followed by detailed discussion of how such payments could be structured to appear as legitimate consulting fees rather than bribes. These recordings directly contradicted the defense's portrayal of Thad as an innocent man wrongfully accused, instead revealing his active efforts to corrupt the legal process. The prosecution's case took an even darker turn, with evidence related to Thad's attempts to arrange harm to prosecutor Harper Harris's teenage daughter from jail, presented through testimony from FBI Special Agent Marcus Coleman. Through routine monitoring of communications from high-risk inmates, we intercepted coded messages from the defendant to a known member of a white supremacist prison gang, Coleman testified, explaining how these messages had been decoded to reveal plans for intimidating or potentially harming the prosecutor's family to derail the case. Coleman presented documentation of wire transfers from accounts controlled by Thad's parents to individuals connected with the prison gang, transfers that had occurred after documented jail visits during which Montgomery Wilson had been observed passing handwritten notes to his son despite strict prohibitions against such exchanges. These communications represent not just obstruction of justice, but active conspiracy to commit violent crimes against an officer of the court, Coleman stated, explaining how this discovery had triggered federal charges separate from the murder case. The prosecution concluded its case with powerful testimony from Vincent and Gabriella D'Angelo, Elena's parents, who provided context about their daughter's life before and during her marriage to Thad. Maintaining remarkable composure despite their evident grief, the D'Angelos described Elena's gradual isolation from family, traditions, and gatherings after her marriage, noting how Thad had initially been charming and engaged, but had become increasingly controlling about their daughter's time and family interactions as the relationship progressed. The final time we saw Elena alive was 3 weeks before her death, Gabriella testified, recounting a brief visit during which Thad had remained present throughout, repeatedly checking his watch and interrupting conversations to remind Elena of other commitments. She managed to whisper to me in the kitchen that she had important things to tell me after the baby was born, that she wouldn't be living with Thad anymore and needed our help. This testimony established that Elena had communicated her leaving plans to multiple trusted individuals, creating a timeline that directly connected her decision to leave with Thad's escalation to violence. As the prosecution rested its case, legal observers noted the comprehensive nature of the evidence presented against Thad Wilson, physical, digital, testimonial, and circumstantial elements that collectively portrayed not just opportunity and means, but clear motive and extensive premeditation. The defense faced the daunting challenge of creating reasonable doubt against this mountainous evidence, with attorney Douglas Swanson's opening statement promises about Elena's emotional instability, thoroughly undermined by medical testimony and contemporaneous documentation. The defense began its case with testimony from character witnesses, including Thad's former colleagues and social acquaintances, who described him as ambitious but fair and dedicated to presenting the perfect family image. These witnesses, however, acknowledged under cross-examination that their interactions with Thad had been primarily in professional or social contexts where appearance management would naturally be prioritized, and that they had little insight into the dynamics of his private relationship with Elena. Thad's mother, Priscilla Wilson, provided emotional testimony about her son's childhood and his excitement about becoming a father, attempting to humanize him before the jury and create contrast with the calculating figure presented in the prosecution's case. Thad was raised to be a provider and protector, she insisted, describing family values that emphasized responsibility and maintaining appearances regardless of private struggles. Under cross-examination, however, Priscilla acknowledged being aware of Thad's affair with Vanessa Reeves and having advised him to handle the situation discreetly, rather than encouraging honesty with his pregnant wife. The defense's strategy suffered a significant blow when their expert witness, psychologist Dr. Howard Gresham, was forced to acknowledge under cross-examination that his opinions about pregnancy-related mood disturbances were based on generalized research rather than specific knowledge of Elena's mental state or medical records. You've never reviewed Ms. D'Angelo Ashford's psychiatric history, spoken with her treating physicians, or analyzed her documented behavior before formulating your opinions about her emotional state. Have you, Doctor? Harris asked pointedly, establishing that the defense expert's testimony was speculative rather than evidence-based. As the third week of trial concluded, the defense's case appeared increasingly fragile against the prosecution's comprehensive evidence of Thad's guilt, setting the stage for the critical decision of whether the defendant would testify in his own defense, a high-risk strategy that would expose him to cross-examination about the numerous contradictions between his initial statements and the established evidence, but potentially the only remaining path to creating reasonable doubt in the jurors' minds. The fourth week of trial began with a tense courtroom atmosphere as defense attorney Douglas Swanson announced that Thaddeus Montgomery Wilson would exercise his constitutional right to testify in his own defense, a high-risk strategy that legal observers interpreted as acknowledgment of the prosecution's overwhelmingly strong case. My client will address this jury directly and explain the tragic circumstances of his wife's death, Swanson stated, his tone suggesting confidence that belied the concern visible in his body language as he guided Thad to the witness stand. Dressed in a conservative navy suit rather than the orange jumpsuit he had worn during jail detention, Thad presented a carefully cultivated image of respectability as he took the oath and settled into the witness chair, his posture straight and his expression appropriately somber. Under Swanson's gentle, direct examination, Thad described his relationship with Elena as loving but complicated by the stresses of pregnancy, claiming that her hormonal changes had transformed her from a supportive partner into someone increasingly paranoid and emotionally volatile during her third trimester. Elena became convinced I was being unfaithful, despite my complete dedication to our marriage and upcoming child, Thad testified, his voice catching in what appeared to be a practiced display of emotion. She would check my phone constantly, accuse me of lying about my whereabouts, and create elaborate scenarios about my supposed betrayals. This narrative attempted to invert the established evidence of his controlling behavior, instead portraying Elena as the unstable partner in their relationship, a strategy that drew visible reactions of disbelief and anger from her family seated in the gallery. Regarding the day of Elena's death, Thad provided a revised account that acknowledged his brief return home during his golf game, a concession necessitated by the irrefutable Tesla GPS evidence. I remembered incorrectly in my initial statements to police because I was in shock, he claimed, explaining that he had indeed returned home briefly to retrieve business documents requested by a colleague, but had found Elena resting and left without disturbing her. When I returned later and found her at the bottom of the stairs, I was completely devastated. I attempted CPR while calling 911, but it was clear she was already gone. When questioned about the incriminating browser searches found on his laptop, Thad offered an explanation that drew skeptical glances from multiple jurors. I was researching a potential investment in a company developing safety products for pregnant women, so I needed to understand the risks and legal framework surrounding pregnancy-related accidents. This claim contradicted not only the specific nature of the searches, which focused on criminal investigations and insurance payouts rather than product development, but also the evidence that he had attempted to permanently erase these searches using specialized software. As Swanson's direct examination concluded, Thad addressed the jury directly with what appeared to be rehearsed sincerity. "I lost my wife and son that day. The family we were building together was destroyed in an instant. I understand the need to find someone responsible for such a tragedy, but I loved Elena and our unborn child more than anything in this world. I could never harm them." This emotional appeal represented the defense's attempt to humanize Thad after weeks of damning evidence, creating reasonable doubt through personal connection with jurors rather than factual refutation of the prosecution's case. Assistant District Attorney Harper Harris approached the witness stand for cross-examination with measured steps, her expression revealing nothing of the personal stakes added by Thad's attempt to orchestrate harm against her daughter from jail, a professional compartmentalization that prosecutors must maintain regardless of circumstances. "Mr. Wilson, you've testified today that your wife was emotionally unstable during pregnancy, yet her obstetrician, colleagues, family members, and contemporaneous medical records all indicate she was psychologically healthy with no unusual mood disturbances. Are all of these sources incorrect in their assessment?" Harris began, establishing immediately that Thad's narrative contradicted virtually all objective evidence about Elena's mental state. The cross-examination methodically dismantled Thad's testimony through a series of precise, evidence-based questions that highlighted the contradictions between his claims and the established facts. You testified that you forgot your brief return home during your golf game due to shock, yet you provided detailed, minute-by-minute accounts of your movements to detectives just hours after Elena's death. Accounts that deliberately omitted this return to your home during the exact window when she was killed. How do you explain remembering specific details about club employees who served you drinks, but forgetting a trip to your own home during which your Tesla was parked in your driveway for 47 minutes? Thad's composure began to crack under Harris's methodical questioning, his rehearsed responses increasingly inadequate against the specific timeline contradictions she presented. You claim you returned home for business documents, yet electronic records show no business communications requesting such documents that day, and no documents were found in your possession when you returned to the golf course. What exactly were these critical documents that required interrupting your golf game, but apparently weren't used for any business purpose afterward? The cross-examination reached its most damaging point when Harris displayed Thad's browser history on the courtroom's large screen, showing the progression of searches from divorce laws regarding pregnant women to methods of staging accidental deaths to insurance payout procedures. You want this jury to believe that searches for pregnant woman fall downstairs accident investigation and life insurance payout timeline pregnant spouse conducted in the 3 weeks before your wife died at the bottom of your stairs were related to a safety product investment, an investment for which you've provided no documentation, business plans, or communications with potential partners? Thad's attempts to maintain his narrative collapsed further when Harris played the recordings obtained through his brother Beckett's cooperation, in which he could be heard coaching his brother on the fabricated timeline they should present to investigators. These recordings were made after Elena's death, Mr. Wilson. Please explain to the jury why an innocent man would need to create a false timeline of his whereabouts and coach witnesses to support that fabrication if he had nothing to hide regarding his wife's death. The cross-examination's most dramatic moment came when Harris presented evidence of the life insurance policy Thad had purchased on Elena just weeks before her death, alongside documentation of his attempt to collect on this policy the day after her funeral. You testified that you were devastated by losing your wife and child, yet financial records show you contacted the insurance company to initiate a claim less than 24 hours after burying them, before sending thank you notes for funeral flowers or arranging for Elena's personal effects to be delivered to her family. Does this reflect the priorities of a grieving husband, Mr. Wilson? As Harris continued her methodical dismantling of Thad's testimony, his carefully constructed facade began to visibly crack, with moments of defensiveness and flashes of the controlling personality that had characterized his relationship with Elena emerging under pressure. "I was trying to be practical during an impossible situation," he snapped when questioned about the insurance claim, his tone momentarily shifting from practiced grief to irritation at having his decisions questioned. "Elena would have wanted me to handle the financial aspects promptly." The cross-examination concluded with Harris presenting the recorded conversations in which Thad had discussed bribing the medical examiner and intimidating witnesses, asking simply, "Mr. Wilson, would an innocent man need to discuss paying $50,000 to influence medical findings or arranging for witnesses to be intimidated?" Thad's response that he had been misunderstood and was exploring all options to defend against false accusations rang hollow against the explicit content of the recordings, his credibility with the jury visibly diminished by the cumulative weight of contradictions between his testimony and the extensive evidence. Following Thad's testimony, the defense called several expert witnesses in an attempt to create alternative explanations for the prosecution's evidence, including a biomechanical engineer who suggested Elena's injuries could potentially be consistent with a complex fall rather than intentional violence. Under cross-examination, however, this expert acknowledged that his analysis didn't account for the medical examiner's findings regarding the sequence of injuries, particularly the evidence of strangulation preceding the blunt force trauma from the fall. The defense's case suffered another significant blow when their digital forensics expert was forced to concede that the specialized software used to erase Thad's browser history was not standard computer maintenance, but rather a tool specifically designed to prevent forensic recovery of deleted data, software that required deliberate research and installation rather than accidental use. This particular program is not something a typical user would encounter or employ for routine privacy maintenance, the expert acknowledged under Harris's pointed questioning, undermining the defense's claim that Thad had simply been protecting his privacy rather than concealing incriminating evidence. As the defense case neared conclusion, a startling development emerged with the revelation that Thad had attempted to arrange another witness intimidation scheme from jail during the trial itself, approaching a new inmate with connections to a different prison gang after his previous attempt had been discovered. This evidence was presented through testimony from jail security officer Marcus Reynolds, who had intercepted handwritten notes from Thad to this inmate containing personal information about Sophia D'Angelo Chen and suggestions for making her reconsider her testimony before the defense presented its closing arguments. Judge Abernathy addressed this development with grave concern, ordering additional security measures for all trial participants and instructing the jury to consider this evidence only as it related to consciousness of guilt, rather than as character evidence, a legal distinction that nonetheless did little to mitigate the impact of Thad's continued attempts to manipulate the justice system through intimidation and threats. The court attempt to interfere with witnesses or court proceedings with the utmost seriousness, the judge stated firmly, her expression reflecting the unusual nature of dealing with active witness tampering during an ongoing murder trial. The defense concluded its case with testimony from Montgomery Wilson, who attempted to rehabilitate his son's image by describing Thad's childhood achievements and apparent dedication to starting a family with Elena. Under cross-examination, however, the former judge was confronted with evidence of his own attempts to influence the case through judicial connections and his role in facilitating communications related to witness intimidation, questions he largely avoided by claiming he didn't recall specific conversations despite documentation of his involvement. As both sides prepared for closing arguments, the prosecution filed a motion for reconsideration of Thad's bail status based on the new evidence of witness tampering attempts during trial, resulting in additional security measures within the courtroom and heightened monitoring of all communications to and from the defendant. This development created a palpable tension in the courtroom as the trial entered its final phase, with the jury now aware not only of Thad's calculated murder of his pregnant wife, but his continued efforts to obstruct justice through corruption and intimidation, even as his trial proceeded. The stage was set for closing arguments that would distill weeks of testimony and hundreds of exhibits into final narratives for the jury's consideration. The prosecution's evidence-based account of a controlling husband who chose murder when his pregnant wife attempted to leave him versus the defense's increasingly tenuous suggestion that Elena's death was a tragic accident being exploited to wrongfully convict a grieving husband whose behavior after her death reflected shock and poor judgment rather than guilt. The courtroom was filled to capacity for closing arguments, with media representatives and legal observers occupying every available seat in the gallery and a line of spectators extending into the hallway of the Travis County Courthouse. 5 weeks of testimony had transformed what initially appeared to be a domestic tragedy into a public reckoning, not just with Thaddeus Montgomery Wilson's actions, but with broader societal failures to recognize and address the warning signs of lethal domestic violence before it culminates in murder. Assistant District Attorney Harper Harris approached the jury with measured steps for her closing argument, her demeanor reflecting the gravity of the case rather than the triumph of a prosecutor who had methodically constructed an overwhelming case against a defendant whose guilt had been established through multiple independent lines of evidence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case began with a simple question. What happened to Elena D'Angelo Ashford and her unborn son on the afternoon of March 15th, 2023? Harris began, her voice clear in the hushed courtroom. After 5 weeks of testimony and evidence, the answer to that question is tragically clear. Using the courtroom's large display screens, Harris presented a comprehensive timeline that integrated all the evidence presented during trial, from Thad's incriminating browser history in the weeks before the murder to the Tesla's GPS data, placing him at the scene during the precise window when Elena was killed, to the financial and personal motives that had driven him to eliminate what he viewed as obstacles to his desired future. This timeline represents not just the methodical planning of a murder, but the calculated behavior of a defendant who believed his privilege and connections would shield him from consequences, Harris stated, highlighting Thad's repeated invocations of his father's judicial position during initial questioning and his subsequent attempts to corrupt the investigation through bribes and intimidation. The prosecutor addressed the defense's evolving narratives directly, noting how Thad's explanation for his wife's death had shifted from complete denial of returning home during his golf game to a revised claim of a brief, innocuous visit once the GPS evidence made his original alibi untenable. When confronted with irrefutable evidence, the defendant has not accepted responsibility, but simply adjusted his lies to accommodate what he cannot deny, Harris observed, connecting this pattern to the controlling behavior Elena had documented in the months before her death, a need to shape reality according to his preferences, regardless of truth or consequences. Harris reminded the jury of the medical evidence that had established Elena's death as a homicide rather than an accident, using anatomical diagrams to explain how the pattern of injuries, manual strangulation followed by blunt force trauma from the fall, could only be explained by intentional violence rather than a simple fall down stairs. Dr. Chen testified that Elena fought for her life, as evidenced by the defensive wounds on her arms and the skin cells recovered from beneath her broken fingernails, cells that match the defendant's DNA and confirm his direct role in the violence that ended her life. The financial dimension of Thad's motive received particular attention in Harris's closing, with documentation of the life insurance policy purchased weeks before Elena's death displayed alongside evidence of his mounting debt and secret financial transfers to offshore accounts. The defendant viewed his wife and unborn child as financial liabilities to be eliminated rather than family members to be cherished and protected, Harris stated, connecting these financial preparations to Thad's research into countries without extradition treaties with the United States, research that suggested plans for potential flight after collecting the insurance payout. Most powerfully, Harris focused on the psychological motive established through extensive testimony and Elena's own documentation of Thad's controlling behavior, explaining how his narcissistic need for ownership had been mortally threatened by her discovery of his affair and decision to leave him after their child's birth. Elena's declaration of independence, her statement that she would raise their son with her sister's help, and that Thad would have only supervised visitation, represented the ultimate loss of control for a man who viewed his wife and child as extensions of himself rather than autonomous human beings. Harris concluded her closing argument by addressing the jury directly, her tone solemn but resolute. The evidence in this case speaks with one clear voice. Thaddeus Montgomery Wilson made a deliberate choice to end two lives rather than accept the consequences of his own actions, rather than allow Elena to leave him and raise their child beyond his control. This wasn't a crime of passion or momentary loss of control. It was the culmination of months of calculation by a man who believed his desires and convenience outweighed his wife's right to life and their son's right to be born. You have both the evidence and the moral clarity needed to deliver the justice Elena and her unborn child deserve. Defense attorney Douglas Swanson faced the formidable challenge of creating reasonable doubt against the prosecution's comprehensive case, his closing argument focusing on emotions rather than evidence as he portrayed Thad as a flawed but essentially decent man caught in tragic circumstances rather than a calculating killer. The prosecution has presented a narrative that makes sense on paper, a tidy story with a clear villain, but human relationships and human tragedies are rarely so simple, Swanson began, attempting to reframe the evidence as circumstantial rather than definitive. Swanson acknowledged the evidence of Thad's affair and his initial dishonesty about his movements on the day of Elena's death, presenting these as moral failings rather than indications of murderous intent. Has my client made mistakes? Absolutely. Did he panic and make poor decisions after finding his wife's body? Without question. But these human weaknesses and errors in judgment do not transform him into a premeditated killer. This strategy attempted to separate Thad's documented deception from the act of murder itself, suggesting alternative explanations for behavior that appeared clearly incriminating when viewed in context. The defense closing struggled notably when addressing the physical evidence, particularly the medical examiner's conclusion that Elena had been strangled before being pushed down the stairs, a finding Swanson could challenge only by suggesting general uncertainty in forensic science rather than presenting specific alternative explanations. Science is not infallible, and medical examiners can disagree about interpretations of injuries, he argued, though the prosecution had presented multiple medical experts whose conclusions aligned consistently with homicide rather than accident. Swanson's strongest arguments centered on creating emotional distance between the jury and the prosecution's portrayal of Thad as calculatingly evil, suggesting instead that he was a complex human being whose poor decisions after Elena's death stemmed from panic and grief rather than consciousness of guilt. In times of overwhelming tragedy, people behave in ways that may seem incomprehensible from the outside, ways that may appear suspicious when scrutinized by investigators determined to build a case, Swanson contended, attempting to humanize Thad's increasingly damning pattern of deception and obstruction. The defense closing concluded with an appeal to the high standard of proof required in criminal cases, with Swanson reminding jurors that beyond reasonable doubt represented the highest evidentiary threshold in American law. If you have any doubt at all, about whether Elena's death was the result of murder rather than a tragic accident, you must return a verdict of not guilty, he insisted, focusing on theoretical uncertainty rather than the specific, overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. Assistant District Attorney Harris delivered a powerful rebuttal, addressing each of the defense's suggested uncertainties with specific evidence that eliminated reasonable alternatives to Thad's guilt. The defense asks you to consider reasonable doubt, and that is precisely your duty, but doubt based on evidence, not speculation or distraction from the facts established in this courtroom. She methodically revisited the key elements of the prosecution's case: the Tesla GPS data placing Thad at the scene, the medical evidence establishing homicide rather than accident, the financial motive evidenced by the life insurance policy, and Thad's documented attempts to obstruct justice through witness intimidation and attempted bribery. The defense suggests we can never know with absolute certainty what happened on March 15, 2023, but that is not what the law requires, Harris reminded the jury. The evidence in this case establishes beyond any reasonable doubt that Thaddeus Montgomery Wilson murdered his pregnant wife when she attempted to leave him, staged her death to appear accidental, and then engaged in an elaborate series of deceptions and obstructions to avoid responsibility for his actions. This is not a close case or one balanced on a knife's edge of uncertainty. It is a case where evidence from multiple independent sources all points to the same inescapable conclusion: the defendant's guilt. Following closing arguments, Judge Constance Abernathy provided detailed instructions to the jury regarding the applicable law and their responsibility to evaluate the evidence presented during trial, emphasizing that they must consider each charge separately and reach unanimous agreement on each count to render a valid verdict. "You are the sole judges of the facts in this case," Judge Abernathy reminded the jurors, "and it is your responsibility to determine what the evidence has established beyond a reasonable doubt." The jury began deliberations at 2:17 p.m. on October 10, 2023, with media representatives and spectators settling in for what many legal observers anticipated would be a multi-day process given the complexity of the case and volume of evidence presented. To the surprise of court veterans, however, the jury sent word to the judge after just 4 hours and 23 minutes that they had reached unanimous verdicts on all charges, a remarkably swift decision in a capital murder case that suggested the strength of the prosecution's evidence had left little room for genuine debate about Thad's guilt. The courtroom fell silent as the jurors filed in at 6:40 p.m., their expressions solemn as they took their seats for the verdict announcement. The jury forewoman, a retired school principal in her early 60s, stood as Judge Abernathy asked if they had reached verdicts on all counts, her "Yes, Your Honor" resonating in the hushed space. The clerk collected the verdict forms and delivered them to the judge, who reviewed them briefly before returning them for public reading, the traditional moment of maximum tension in a criminal trial. On the count of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant, Thaddeus Montgomery Wilson, guilty. The forewoman's voice remained steady as she continued through the remaining counts. Guilty of intentional homicide of an unborn child, guilty of tampering with evidence, guilty of insurance fraud, guilty of obstruction of justice, guilty of domestic abuse, guilty of witness intimidation. Each pronouncement of guilt seemed to physically diminish Thad at the defense table, his posture collapsing incrementally as the unanimous rejection of his version of events became clear. Judge Abernathy thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for October 24, 2023, ordering Thad remanded to custody under enhanced security measures given his previous attempts at witness intimidation and obstruction. As bailiffs approached to escort him from the courtroom, Thad turned toward his parents in the gallery with an expression of disbelief, the reality that his family connections and privilege had failed to shield him from consequences, finally penetrating the narcissistic certainty that had characterized his behavior throughout the investigation and trial. The sentencing hearing on October 24th drew even greater public attention than the trial itself, with victims' rights advocates organizing a silent vigil outside the courthouse in memory of Elena and her unborn son. Inside, the proceedings began with victim impact statements from Elena's family, with Sophia D'Angelo Chen speaking first about the devastating loss of her sister and the nephew she had been preparing to help raise. "Elena was not just my sister, but my best friend, my confidant, and soon-to-be co-parent to little Alexander," Sophia stated, her voice steady despite her evident grief. She had such plans for their future, a nursery decorated with constellations because she wanted him to always reach for the stars, children's books in both English and Italian to connect him to his heritage, a journal where she had already begun writing letters to him about the kind of person she hoped he would become. This humanizing of Elena and her unborn child clearly affected several jurors who had returned to observe the sentencing. The abstract victim of legal proceedings transformed into a real woman with hopes and plans destroyed by Thad's violence. Vincent and Gabriella D'Angelo spoke together, the elderly couple supporting each other physically and emotionally as they addressed the court about the multi-generational impact of their daughter's murder. We lost not only our beloved daughter, but the opportunity to be grandparents, to pass down family traditions, to see our lineage continue through Alexander, Vincent stated, his voice breaking as he described how Elena had planned to name her son after his grandfather. The defendant didn't just take 2 lives, he fractured an entire family's future, leaving a wound that can never fully heal. The sentencing hearing's most powerful moment came when prosecutor Harper Harris presented a final piece of evidence permitted specifically for sentencing consideration, a sonogram image taken during Elena's last prenatal appointment, showing the developed features of her son at 27 weeks gestation. This is Alexander Vincent D'Angelo Ashford, Harris stated simply, the image displayed on the courtroom's large screen as she reminded the court that Texas law recognized him as a full victim entitled to justice, not merely an extension of his mother. Defense attorney Douglas Swanson presented standard mitigating arguments regarding Thad's lack of prior criminal history and potential for rehabilitation, but these conventional sentencing points felt hollow against the gravity of the premeditated double homicide established at trial. Thad himself declined the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, his silence interpreted by observers as final evidence of his inability to acknowledge the human consequences of his actions. Judge Constance Abernathy then delivered what observers would later describe as one of the most powerful sentencing statements in Texas judicial history, her measured voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, as she addressed not just the legal requirements of sentencing, but the moral dimensions of Thad's crimes. In my 30 years on the bench, I have presided over many cases of shocking violence and depravity, Judge Abernathy began, but rarely have I encountered a crime that combined such cold calculation with such profound betrayal of the most fundamental human relationships. The judge methodically reviewed the evidence that had established not just Thad's guilt, but the calculated nature of his actions, from the weeks of planning evidenced by his browser history, to his elaborate efforts to establish a false alibi, to his continued attempts to obstruct justice through intimidation and corruption, even during trial. This was not a crime of passion or momentary lapse in judgment, Judge Abernathy observed, but a premeditated decision to eliminate 2 human beings who had become inconvenient to your desired lifestyle, a calculated choice to end lives rather than accept the natural consequences of your own actions. Judge Abernathy addressed the particularly troubling aspect of Thad's apparent belief that his family connections and privilege would shield him from accountability, noting how his repeated invocations of his father's judicial position during initial questioning reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the legal system's purpose. The law applies equally to all, regardless of wealth, family connections, or social status, the judge stated firmly, and the evidence in this case established beyond any question that you committed premeditated murder against not 1 but 2 victims, one of whom never had the opportunity to draw breath in this world because of your actions. The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Judge Abernathy delivered her sentence. For the murder of Elena D'Angelo Ashford, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the intentional homicide of Alexander Vincent D'Angelo Ashford, this court sentences you to an additional 50 years imprisonment, to be served consecutively rather than concurrently with your life sentence. The judge continued through the remaining charges, adding substantial consecutive sentences for each count of obstruction, witness intimidation, and fraud, a sentencing structure that ensured Thad would never be eligible for release regardless of potential future changes to parole eligibility for life sentences. This sentence reflects not just the legal maximum allowed under Texas law, but this court's assessment that you represent an ongoing danger to society through your demonstrated willingness to manipulate, intimidate, and harm others to serve your own interests, Judge Abernathy concluded, her expression reflecting the gravity of consigning a human being to spend the remainder of his life in prison. Your actions have forfeited your right to freedom in a society governed by laws and mutual respect for human life. As Thad was led from the courtroom for the final time, the reality of his life sentence visibly registered in his expression. The calculated gamble that had begun with his decision to murder his pregnant wife rather than accept her leaving him had ended with the permanent loss of his own freedom. Outside the courthouse, Elena's family embraced in a circle of shared grief and relief at the justice that had been served, their private loss having become a public case that legal observers would study for years as an example of comprehensive prosecution of domestic homicide and the recognition of fetal victims under Texas law. In the months following Thad's sentencing, the case prompted legislative review of domestic violence laws in Texas, with Elena's law passed in 2024 to strengthen monitoring of domestic abusers and improve coordination between family courts and criminal courts in cases involving controlling behavior that had not yet escalated to physical violence. Sophia D'Angelo Chen established a foundation in her sister's name dedicated to educating young people about the warning signs of controlling relationships, using Elena's meticulously documented experience as a teaching tool for recognizing the progression from psychological control to potential lethal violence. The prosecutor who had methodically built the case against Thad Wilson, Harper Harris, received the Texas District and County Attorneys Association's Prosecutor of the Year award for her handling of the case, particularly her integration of digital forensic evidence with traditional investigative methods to establish Thad's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. In her acceptance speech, Harris emphasized that the case represented not just individual justice for Elena and her unborn son, but a broader societal recognition that domestic homicide rarely occurs without warning signs, signs that Elena had recognized and documented, but that social systems had failed to address before they culminated in tragedy. 5 years after Elena's murder, a follow-up documentary revealed that Thaddeus Montgomery Wilson remained incarcerated in a maximum security facility, his appeals having been rejected at every level as the evidence of his guilt withstood all procedural challenges. The once privileged investment banker now occupied a standard cell, his days structured by prison routines, rather than the control he had exercised over Elena's life. A man who had chosen murder when faced with losing control now lived in an environment where virtually every aspect of his existence was controlled by others, perhaps the most fitting justice for the crime he had committed. Elena's story, though ending in tragedy, had become a powerful educational tool for domestic violence prevention. Her meticulous documentation of Thad's controlling behavior, now used in training programs for law enforcement, healthcare providers, and educators to identify the warning signs of potentially lethal domestic relationships before they escalate to violence. Through this legacy, something positive had emerged from the devastating loss of 2 lives on that March afternoon in Austin, a societal recognition that controlling behavior represents not merely relationship dysfunction, but a potential precursor to lethal violence that demands serious intervention before it culminates in tragedy.